you would be hard-pressed to find someone who finds this text easy to read. What if you added spaces between the words? That certainly makes the text much more legible. But one tiny punctuation mark can change the meaning of text so easily. The way this text is presented now, I could be introducing the content that I'm going to talk about in this video. Why punctuation and word spacing really do make a difference. But with one simple comma, and an exclamation mark for good measure, I can take this statement of intent and flip it to one of mild surprise. Why punctuation and word spacing really do make a difference. So, do they? Or, to be more specific, what's the point of punctuation and word spacing? Let's start with punctuation. Interestingly, the term punctuation derives from the Latin punctus, or point. And today, we recognize 2 points, or functions, of punctuation. The first is to help with oral delivery, or elocution. The punctuation in a text is like a set of instructions on how to read a text aloud. So it is one aspect of written speech and a kind of phonetic transcription for stress, pause, and intonation. In its second function, or syntactic function, punctuation is used to convey meaning. As a quick reminder, syntax is the way in which words and punctuation are used and arranged to form phrases, clauses, and sentences. In its syntactic function, punctuation conveys meaning, as Scholes and Willis state, by identifying lexical elements and clausal, phrasal, and sentence structure. So, punctuation guides us in how to read text aloud and conveys meaning by identifying sentence structure in written text. And the point of word spacing? Let's look at that line of text again. How easy is this to read? What about this? Word spacing is so important when it comes to reading text because it tells us where audible gaps or pauses take place. With typography, word spacing shows this unspoken aspect of speech. Otherwise, it would be hard for people to read one long continuous line of letters, such as this. When text and spacing are consistent, written words, as we know them today, obviously become much easier to read. But how did we get to where we are today? Specifically, how did we arrive at the current functionalities of punctuation and word spacing? To understand, we should first look back in history to see what came before, because, as we know from Ong, to have a better understanding of how writing technologies may be modifying human ways of knowing, it helps to situate them in a historical context and put the changes we are living today in perspective. Let's look at late Latin texts for a glimpse of what language looked like with no punctuation and no spaces between words. As we can see here, the text contains no divisions between words. This kind of text is commonly referred to as scriptura continua, which is Latin for continuous script. It's a style of writing without spaces or other forms of punctuation between the words or sentences. In an important moment in the history of writing, scriptura continua was first disrupted by Irish scribes in the 7th century. What caused the scribes to make this change? Adding spaces between words and introducing punctuation stemmed from the desire to make Latin more readable to those for whom it was a foreign language. The move from parchment to paper in the later Middle Ages also contributed to the evolution of word spacing and punctuation. With these new writing materials, scribes began to refashion the writing space they'd inherited from ancient practices and started employing word division and punctuation in order to organize the text visually on the page. Paper could also be produced in greater quantities and could supply the growing demand for reading materials, and with it, text that was more readable for a growing population of readers. It's the word readable that I want to pay close attention to here, so we can examine the ways punctuation and word spacing met the needs of the culture that produced it, and why it evolved when it did. As mentioned earlier, silent reading emerged among a large proportion of the literate population around the 17th century. This increasing population of silent readers had a significant effect on the syntactic function of text, and vice versa. Remember, the syntactic or grammatical function views punctuation as a set of conventions for marking grammatical relationships in a text that's intended to be viewed as a written document. That is, one that will be widespread and read by many, or readable. However, the move towards a grammatically based model of punctuation was very slow in coming. Perhaps the move was slow because of the shift described by Sanger. As Sanger points out, isolating one word from the next amidst a block of unspaced text had once been the cognitive function of the reader of scriptura continua, but this punctuation then became the task of the scribe, or author. This task made reading easier for the general population, but the author, or scribe of the original text, had to carry this cognitive load. To state this shift in even more simple terms, up until the 17th century, the dominant functions of writing were to record formal transactions or to enable readers to represent speech at a future time. When punctuation marks started to appear in text, they were used to indicate pauses in Latin texts meant to be read aloud. However, by the early 18th century, this oral role shifted to a more literate one. Punctuation began to indicate grammatical or logical relationships in writing to aid the growing population of silent readers. So, punctuation and word spacing met the silent reading needs of the culture that produced it, but what forms of knowing or thinking did they invite? Remember when we talked about the function of punctuation and how punctuation is like a set of instructions on how to read or interpret a text? Punctuation is seen as a way for the meaning of the author to be more clearly and readily comprehended by the reader. We now have job roles like that of editor, a person whose job it is to restore the author's text so that each reader should understand the text exactly as the author intended it to be. In some instances, people may regard this grammatical function as limiting the creative process, especially in creative works such as plays, poetry, or screenplays. Take the actor Christopher Walken, for example. When he receives a script, he immediately crosses out all the punctuation. He says by doing this, it lets you decide what the important word is. It might be the noun, it might be the verb, it might be the word you never thought of. This demonstrates the power punctuation has in telling us how we should interpret a text, how we should think, how we should comprehend. And while in some cases this is a good thing, when it comes to creative minds such as Walken, it may also be a hindrance if people don't want the writer's original punctuation to be the authoritative source. One final question I want to ask is, did punctuation and word spacing advance or slow progress toward mass literacy? I've already briefly touched on this, but I want to be even more explicit here. Over time, word separation and other visual marks of punctuation simplified the neurophysiological process of reading. This was the important change that allowed readers to silently receive the text and encoded information that allows for comprehension. Because it simplified the reading process, it helped advance the trend of silent reading and advanced progress toward mass literacy. By saving the reader the time-consuming process of interpreting pauses and breaks, the inclusion of spaces enables the brain to understand written text much more rapidly. Taking this one step further, the brain has a greater capacity to synthesize text and commit greater portions of information to memory. Take a look at this news clipping from 1895, where the virtues of punctuation were discussed. Just as all other labor-saving, expeditious inventions, the use of points in punctuating language to bring out ideas and thoughts with greater facility is the legitimate child of mother necessity. How exactly does it make reading easier? Rayner and Palatzek found that when punctuation was removed from text, the speed of the reader's comprehension was disrupted. They attribute this to the idea that we have come to rely on the visual signs of punctuation to regulate the way our eyes move across a page when reading. Because punctuation allows for syntactical consistency, our brain doesn't have to do as much work in order to comprehend the text on a page, and we are able to read silently and rapidly, thus increasing math literacy.